So I'm very pleased to have you here. The floor is all yours, so please enjoy the talk as much as I will.
Okay, thank you. I always enjoy giving talks, so that should be okay. And especially here, because Eindhoven, I was born here, so that's always good to go home. And my parents studied here, so that's also, and my sister. So we have a big relationship with this place. I'm not sure, in the medical field, you always have to disclosure, so let me do that here as well. So we work with companies quite a bit on this, as well as public research funding, which you can read here. So I always break this talk up into 4 parts. So the first part is why. Why do we want to do this? Why do we want to use big data? What's the rationale? You always have to know why you do stuff to get out of bed this morning. What is it, big data in cancer? How do we learn from it? What are the techniques there? And then translation to clinical practice. So we'll have 4 parts. I usually talk about 45 minutes, and then we have time for questions, hopefully. So the rationale. So I explained the problem of predictions in medicine with tulips, because we live in Holland, right? Of course, we don't have tulips in Eindhoven nor in Maastricht, but nobody knows this. So they think we all have tulips, and that's good. So the question is, suppose you are a tulip farmer in Holland, and you've bought 2 crates of tulips. So you bought a pink crate of tulips and a yellow crate of tulip bulbs. But the problem with tulip bulbs is you can't see what color they become, right? So you can't see on the bulb. And, but you have those 2 colors, and as a farmer, you want your field to look like that. You want your field to have pink and yellows, because then you can harvest those flowers and you can sell them to the Albert Heijn. Yeah? And you don't want them to look like this, because then it's a mess. So you have those 2 crates, and you hire a student to work with you in the summer, and the student doesn't know how to operate, the truck, and the student drops the 2 crates. And now your tulip bulbs are on your land, they're spread around, and you have this problem now, right? Because you want your field to look like this, but they're all thrown through each other. So you hire an expert. You hire a tulip expert, and you tell the tulip expert, pick up a tulip and see from the outside with all your knowledge what color it will become. And put the one you're sure are going to be pink on the left-hand side of my field, and put the one you're sure are going to be yellow on the right-hand side of the field, and put the one you're unsure about in the middle. It's called an ordering experiment, where you test the outcome of a prediction. And of course, you know that 50% of your tulip bulbs are yellow and 50% are pink. But the question is about individual predictions now. This tulip bulb, what color will it become? If you have a perfect expert, your tulip field will look like this in the after a few months. And the metric of this is area under the curve. It's a quality of a prediction. And 1 is a perfect predictor. If you know nothing about tulip bulbs, it will look like this. You see it's kind of random, area under the curve is 0.5. And if you're somewhere in the middle, you see there's more yellow on the right-hand side and more pink on the left-hand side, it's 0.72. Just to give you a feeling of the predictive, of the value of area under the curve. Now, we don't grow tulips at MAASTRO clinic. We irradiate cancer patients, and we treat lung cancer patients, amongst others. But we asked our physicians more or less the same question. We gave our physician 30 charts of lung cancer patients. And we ripped everything out what happened after the therapy. So they had all the information about the patient except what happened after therapy. And we asked them, read this chart and predict, will this patient be alive at 2 years? If you're sure of that, put them on the right-hand side. If this patient sure is going to be dead at 2 years, put them on the left-hand side, and put the one you're unsure about in the middle. So same metric, area under the curve. And one of my questions to you guys is, and you can't answer because you know, where do you think the doctors are when they make this prediction? How good are doctors at MAASTRO clinic, at my clinic, in predicting 2-year survival in lung cancer patients? Who thinks they're very good at this? Nobody, right? That's almost impossible. Who thinks they're around this part? 3, 4, 5. Who thinks they're total rubbish? 1, 2, 3. Oh, you? No? Oh, okay. So the people, the true answer of this experiment is 0.57. And if you put a confidence interval on that, 0.5 is in that confidence interval. Which means that, oh, that's a bit off. So we had 8 doctors predicting survival, and they were very young doctors there, very experienced doctor. That didn't matter, right? So experience doesn't count. And so this is almost a random prediction. They can't predict this. Now, when we do tests with doctors, they're not always pleased with this, and so they were complaining about that test. They said, well, we didn't see the patient. And when you see the patient, this is when the magic happens, right? It's a human thing about doctors and patients, and that's where they're good at. So they thought it was unfair that they had to do this from paper. So we said, fine, change the experiment. Every time a patient came into the door at MAASTRO for 2 years, they had to predict, will this patient be alive or dead? Will this patient have a toxicity? And the most common toxicity is a radiation pneumonitis of the lungs and radiation esophagitis of the esophagus. They had to predict those 3 things. It took 2 years to do. More patients, more experienced doctors. The end result was 0.56. No better. So this is a random prediction. And this is interesting, this is psychology. So unskilled and unaware of it, how difficulties in recognizing one's own incompetence leads to inflated self-assessments. And these are student tests, so these are the worst students, these are the top students. This is the actual result, and this is what they thought they got. Right? When you have kids like me, you have this experience as well, that if they know nothing about a subject, they think very highly of themselves. And here, when you know more about the subject, these things come together. So our physicians are here. They think they can predict this, but they can't. Okay. Now, why is that a problem, you might think? Well, there are a few problems with this. The first problem is that when you have lung cancer and you walk into a MAASTRO clinic and you ask, will it be alive at 2 years, the answer you get from a physician is just as good as tossing a coin, which is annoying, because you want to plan your life, right? The other thing that's difficult is if you can't predict the outcome of a treatment A or the outcome of treatment B, how are you going to decide between A and B? How do you know which one's better for me or for you as a patient? The other thing you don't know is if you can't predict the outcome of a treatment, how do you know that you're doing a good job? How do you know your quality is good? If you can't predict the outcome of a treatment, how do you know which patient the treatment will not work and you need to investigate, you need to do science in? All these things are becoming a problem because we can't predict outcomes. That's why we work on this problem. So why is that? Why is that a problem? Well, we don't really know, but we do know a couple of things. So first of all, the first problem is that the doctors see way too much data. Right? We throw data at doctors from imaging and from genomics. And the problem with doctors is, because they're human, a human can take 5 things into account when they make a decision. If you have more than 5 things to consider, you start making mistakes, and you can't weigh them properly. Okay? There's a reason why in the ER, there's on the wall a flow chart for chest pain, because there's more than 5 things to consider. And when you walk into chest pain to an ER room, they have to follow the line, and they don't want doctors to think there, right? Because there are more than 5 things to consider. So that's one issue, an explosion of data. The other problem is an explosion of decisions. Breast cancer used to be 1 disease, now it's 8. And all these 8 have different treatments. Prostate cancer must have 5 treatments which are equally good in terms of survival. Right? So there's more decisions to be taken than ever. The assumption of our field of evidence-based medicine is on the things you know about a patient and the decisions you might take, that you look up the guideline, or you look up the literature, and you read what's best. The problem is, if you want to read the literature, you're reading about 8 hours a day if you do lung cancer radiotherapy. So you can't read the literature. This is why Watson comes in. But the things that are in literature are very biased. There's only 3% of cancer patients in clinical trials, and they're always young, fit women. So the elderly, still smoking black man sitting in front of you, you don't have any data on that, if you're honest. That's one issue. The trend is bias. And also in technology, especially my field of medical physics, we introduced technology, the new scanner of Philips. Why do you introduce a new scanner of Philips? Well, it's a new scanner of Philips. It's more accurate. It has better pictures. Sure, but by how much? How much does that change the outcome? We don't know. Right? It's a sharper knife, but we don't know how much sharper. Right? So if the British Medical Journal took 3,000 therapies out of medicine, not just cancer, 3,000 they took out of medicine, and they looked what's the evidence base for that treatment. And this is the results. In 1/6 of treatments in medicine, we know that they work. In 1/6 of treatments, we know that they don't work, but we do them nonetheless. In half of the treatments, we don't have evidence for that. So that's the state of evidence-based medicine and where we ask our physicians to operate in. Our medical doctor has now made announcement that he thinks it's unethical to ask doctors to make decisions on treatments. Because it's not possible. This is not a human task. Okay? And so that's the rationale of this work, and we want to change that paradigm. And the idea is to go towards more data-driven medicine, to think, well, we collect every day on every patient data. Can we use that data? Can we get knowledge out of that data? Can we then do something different in the next patient? Can we check what happens to that patient? Do you have new data? And can we have that circle running in every hospital rather than just relying on what we do now, which is clinical trials, you know, lab research, animal research, phase 1, 2, 3 human trials, and then we introduce something, and then it stays there for 25 years. Because the innovation cycle that we have here takes about 15 years, right? Can we have this running in every hospital in 24 hours? Can we have this running real time? Those are the questions we ask ourselves. Drive in medicine from data. It doesn't mean that clinical trials are useless. They're not. They're very good at detecting very small difference effectively, right? But they need to be complemented, we feel, by real-world data and data-driven medicine. Okay, so that's the rationale. Part 2, the data. What data is there in medicine, and oncology specifically? When you think about, suppose you want to learn from a recent decade of data, so 2005 to 2015, there are about 140 million cancer patients in the world. So that's the size of the data in terms of patients. Suppose you have about 100 megabytes to 10 gigs per patient. So at MAASTRO we generate about 10 gigs per patient, but of course in other less developed parts of the world there will be less. Then you have about 14 to 1400 petabytes of data. Let's say 500 petabytes of data. Is that a lot? No, that's not big. Google has an order of magnitude more data. We know this from the energy consumption that they have. The CERN collider produces about, I think, 50 petabytes per year now, which so that's doable. The size of the data is not that big. One of the issues that we're facing is that 80% of the data is unstructured. And the main unstructuredness is imaging. So this is a picture of what hospitals have, and the big yellow bar is imaging. So those are pixels. But if you know anything about the field at the moment in AI, there's deep learning, there is image mining, and so we're pretty good at detecting, what's a cat and what's whose face is that, and all that. So we're also pretty good at detecting, where's the lung, where's the tumor, what kind of tumor it is. It's called radiomics nowadays. And getting structure out of unstructured data is kind of, I won't say a solved problem, but it's close, right? And the same thing is, if I want to call my wife, I talk to Siri, so that's also, free text to structured data is also quite well developed. So it's not really a worry, that unstructuredness, I'll solve. What is the real problem in medicine, and in cancer as well, is the number of hospitals. This data is spread around 100,000 hospitals in the world, and we can't get to it. So there's these pockets of data. And so the problem is not the size, it's not the structure, it is the disperseness, the fact that it's so distributed. That's the main issue of big data in medicine, in our view. So how do we share data then? Suppose I call Sydney, Australia, and I say, here's the Excel sheet, fill in your data for me, right, of lung cancer patients. Suppose I ask that. Well, how do we do that? What we do is we have to start a project together, and we have the Dutch Cancer Society or the European or the Australian minister pay for it, and we do clinical research. And what we do there is we collect a whole lot of data elements on very few patients. On about 3% of the patients, we collect very high quality data. So you see very few missing data here. Okay, that's option 1. Option 2 is to start a cancer registry, right? We have one in Holland as well. What we do in the cancer registry together is we share data on all patients, but we share very few data elements. Otherwise, it will be too much work. Okay? And the quality in the cancer registry is generally less than in a clinical trial. Those two are interesting, but our real interest is in the middle, which is the routine data. Because the routine data has all the patients and all the data elements, but it's very low quality. But still, if you count the green dots in the middle, you have 10 times as much more data points than on the sides. So we're trying to get data out of routine care. That's our goal. But when you ask, when you send your Excel sheet to Australia and you say, fill this one in for me, you get a few answers. The first answer you get is, I don't have the time for that. I don't have the resources to fill in your Excel sheet, right? I know data differently. I don't capture the data. Our doctors don't have time to record all that data in the room with the patient. So that's the first answer you get. I don't have the time or the money. The second answer you get is, I don't want to. I don't want you to have my data, because you might find out that I'm doing something bad. Or I want to publish on my own data. I don't want you to look at my data. If you find out I'm doing a bad job, my patient may go to the other side. Catharina may lose patients to Maxima. That stuff. Okay. I don't want to. The third reason you get is, I'm not allowed to. The law prevents me from sharing the data. If people say that, what they really mean is they don't want to, or they don't have the time, right? That's because every legal system in the world allows you to share data for research. It takes an agreement, it takes anonymization, it takes asking patients consent, but it can be done. It's a matter of resources or a will. So it's not illegal. The law doesn't prevent this at all. Technically, we're streaming Netflix movies all the time, and that's not the issue. Technical data sharing is really quite well solved. Okay. But still, these barriers are there, and so we decided a long time ago, probably about 10 years ago, we were working with Siemens at the time, and we were talking to them and said, this is a problem. It was then, well, I guess it's an equal big problem now. We said, well, if we want to build an infrastructure to do learning, we have to find a way to not share data, right? So if sharing is such a problem, then don't. Think about a system where you don't need to share the data. But then you have a Mountain and Muhammad problem. Because if the mountain doesn't come to Muhammad, Muhammad has to go to the mountain. And so we said, well, if the research, if all the data doesn't come to Maastricht, we have to bring researchers to the data, right? If the data can't come to the research, you have to bring the researchers to the data. In the beginning, that meant a lot of traveling, right? We sent people around the world and analyzed people's data. Of course, that's not a scalable solution. So we're at the same time, we're figuring out how to do this. So that's the, and so what are the challenges there? Well, the first challenge then is you have to have this system where you put your research application, or your research question in an application, and you send it somewhere, right? You send it to Australia, for instance. So we call this a train. So your question is in a train. So for instance, the question could be, what factors determine 2-year survival in a lung cancer patient? That's a question you can put in a train and send to Australia to ask there on their data. Right? But that train, that starts running in that hospital has to be secured. So we have to know who sends the train. Is it a virus? Is it signed? The security? Whose patients, log, which station does it enter? So there's a lot of track and governance involved in having that system running. The other problem that you have is the research application, when you send it to Shanghai, that application doesn't understand Chinese, right? So the data in China has to be in a state where a machine, or an application machine, can understand the data. Not just read the data, but understand the data. And that's difficult. And nowadays we call this FAIR, so when we started it wasn't that nice acronym, now it is. So FAIR, we have to create FAIR data stations of every hospital, but also every GP, every patient, every cancer registry. And what does it mean? It means that we have to make data findable, accessible, doesn't mean open. Huh? Accessible means that is there consent, and you can do a lot, negotiations there. It has to be interoperable, very important, and reusable. So that's what's called FAIR. So those are the challenges that we work on. How can we build a train system? How can we make FAIR data stations? And at the moment, we have about 25 cancer centers in the world where we do this. So we do this, we send trains around, and we analyze their data. We've made this was very paternalistic and is still very paternalistic. We're now moving towards how can we involve citizens and patients in that. And that's called the personal health train. You see this metaphor coming up. And we made a movie or an animation out of that, which I will show next.
The personal health train's main goal is connecting health data to make them more usable. Personal health management requires increasing amounts of personal data. But today, this information cannot easily be used because the data are produced and managed by various healthcare providers, authorities, and more by citizens themselves. These stakeholders collect and manage their data in different ways, making the data hard to find and use. Furthermore, personal medical information is very privacy sensitive. As a consequence, personal health data cannot be used easily by citizens themselves, by physicians, and by researchers. The personal health train goes to the root of this problem by building fair data stations. Fair protocols ensure that data are findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. These data stations are connected by tracks, which are strictly secured and protected. Fair data trains are constantly monitored, and only trains with the appropriate validation may enter a particular station. To secure privacy, every data station has rules. Each data owner has access to his or her secured station and can easily request and control one's personal information. In addition, the owner can set rules for who can access the data and how it may be used. Communities with common interests, like patient societies, can choose to connect and organize their information through umbrella stations. With this access, a researcher can learn, for example, which cancer patients benefit most from novel therapies such as proton therapy. Or a citizen with a specific variant in his genome can be automatically alerted when new research results, insights, or possible risks become available. In this approach, the information is accessible for research, prevention, and education without the data ever leaving the station. With the personal health train, health data becomes available whilst individuals and institutions maintain control.
That's the vision for the next 2 years for the Netherlands, and we have this now running in various pilots for instance, at the health insurance companies or Zorginstituut or cancer registries are playing around with it to get that done. Just because this is technology university, I thought, I'll give you one little peek about technology that we're using. So we're using Dockers, we use semantic web a lot for fair data. The way this, just to show you an example of findable data. So when data is at an endpoint, you want to understand what the structure is of that data. And here you see, an endpoint being analyzed based on semantic web, and so from the data, you get an idea of the schema that is in the endpoint. So you have here a patient, and a patient has a disease, non-small lung cancer, and if you see here, you probably can't read it, but this is an ontology that has defined non-small cell lung cancer, a subtype of lung cancer. And this is a volume of it's a volume of something of the tumor, and it has cubic centimeter, which is from another ontology. So all these colors are different ontologies that we use, but importantly, data become findable, but also the metadata and the structure of the data become findable. And this is where we use semantic web for, as an example. This is the first project that we did in our region. So the idea is the following. Hasselt in Belgium has some patient data, which is these red and black data. Suppose that there's survival, and when you have Hasselt learn a model on their data, so prediction model, they might separate the two populations with this blue line. So that's their model. So that is the model that separates their patients the best. So they learn the blue line. And then all the other centers in the network, so Liège learns a green line, and we are in a purple, and there's red in Catharina, and there's Uniclinicum has orange. And so everyone shares their line, not the data, but their line. Huh? And then so you can create consensus, in this case averaging, and you get the black line, which is the consensus line. And now you've learned, this is an iterative thing, you can learn a globally optimal model without a single patient exchanged. That's the idea of distributed learning. And here's an example. So if you have only 7 patients, like they did in Aachen, and you validate in Liège, and you get quite a bad area under the curve, if all of us come together and validate in Liège, you get quite decent area under the curves. And this is for exactly the same prediction as we asked our physicians: 2-year survival in non-small cell lung cancer. So you can see that you can predict that to some extent, but you need data for that. One of the questions that we get often is, well, this whole system of distributed learning, intuitively you might think, well, isn't it better just to put all the data into one spot and learn from there? Don't you lose any quality of the model? Is this really optimal? And the answer is yes. We can prove this mathematically. But this is an example. So here you have the difference between the centrally learned models, all putting data into one place, and the distributed learned model. And you can see that based on the number of iterations, you can get arbitrarily close to the central solution. And you can prove mathematically that the formula you read, this is support vector machines, the formula you get from this distributed learning is exactly the same as the formula you get from centralized learning. And this is true not just for support vectors, also for all regression models, also for Cox models, and recently in the past, well, a year ago, it was proven for deep learning as well. So the message is there is no downside to doing this. Okay. So suppose you have that data. How do you learn? How do you make a prediction model? That's the third part. Now we always make models with experts. So we don't at all believe in the idea of a nerd pressing a button and thinking that he or she can learn a model. This will not work in medicine, and so you need doctors to drive your hypothesis, to say to the machine that's learning, or to the machine learner, you know, what are the things that I know are important. Then you pre-process and you split the data. I'll come back to validation later. You have your feature selection, your classification and the model, and then your performance evaluations. That's the standard way of doing it, but crucially we have an expert in the room that drives it. One of the questions we get often, how much data do you need to get a good model? Well, the rule of thumb is that we need about 10 events per input feature. And this is done to prevent overfitting. So an example, suppose you have 200 lung cancer patients, and you have 25% survival at 2 years. You have about 50 events. And sorry, this is an error. And you can select 5 input features. So the model cannot be more complex than 5 features. That's a rule of thumb that we have at MAASTRO. More patients is always better, but more features usually means overfitting. Okay, so that's the rule of thumb. So you need data or simple models. Which machine learning algorithm do you choose? Well, there are literally 100 of them. What we usually look at are a few things. The first is, how good is it in this AUC thing? How good is it splitting the populations into a surviving and a non-surviving population? That's the first question, right? You want to have power. The second question is calibration. If the model predicts one group has 30% survival, the other group has 50% survival, how good is that 50 and 30? How accurate is that? That's a different question from the split of the two groups. Then how interpretable is it? So we don't like deep learning, for instance, because it is very powerful, but you can't understand it well, so you can't show it to physicians. So we lack transparent models. Can it handle low data quality? Because we have that in medicine. And can it be learned in a distributed setting? So those are questions. Now, many people build a career on machine learning. We don't. We looked at, I think, 12 different data sets in our field, and we looked at different machine learning algorithms on the y-axis, and we looked at how they are performing. So this is AUC again. So this is the best performing, and this is the worst performing. And the first thing you see is it doesn't depend on your machine learning algorithm. It depends on your data, right? Because this is a data set without any signals, and machine learning will not save you. And if it's a data set with a lot of signal, almost all machine learning will help you. If you want to make a choice in our field, probably this one is kind of okay, and this is a simple logistic regression model. So we don't believe that you should complicate your machine learning too much. Start with logistic regression and then work on that. Of course, there are reasons to do certain machine learning algorithms and to perhaps make them better. But the crucial fact is you have to look at your data. The data is the determinant factor, not the machine learning algorithm. the data qualities that we're facing are the following. Unstructuredness, I talked about this. Understandability, I talked about this as well. Missing data is an issue that we're facing. Incorrect data or implausible data, right? That's something you deal with. Contradicting data, this for a non-medical person might not say this is contradicting, but you can't have an M0 and a stage 4, that's a contradiction. Data are biased. For instance, this is a calibration of a PET scanner. If your PET scanner is calibrated differently between two hospitals, you get different values, right? And you have a bias between your cohorts. And then there's a very tricky one, which is called bias missing. In medicine, we tend to only note things that are important, like, oh, this patient got a severe toxicity. But we don't note if the patient did not get a toxicity, or only a mild one. Which means that if the data is missing, it is more likely to be a mild or no toxicity than a severe toxicity, which means the data is not randomly missing. And this is quite hard in classical statistics. Now this is where machine learning really can help you to figure that out. Garbage in, garbage out is a complaint that we get often, you know, if this data is so messed up, how do you get beautiful things? This is a picture made out of garbage, so if you look long enough, you can make a beautiful picture, we feel. And one example, missing data. This is the area on the curve and this is the amount of missing data, and you can actually see that this is one of the examples of random forest, is that you can have a lot of missing data and still have a pretty decent model. So missingness of data is not a big concern. What is a big concern in the field is this, validation. Probably I reject about 90% of the papers in this field because they didn't do this well. And validation is crucial, crucial, crucial. I can't stress it enough. This is the tripod statement, and the tripod statement is a statement of editors of high impact journals that says we want to end all this messiness of prediction model publishing. We're going to have a classification scheme on how well the validation was done. And this is type 1 to type 4. Type 1 validation is somebody has a data set and they machine learn on it, but they don't validate at all. Well, any machine learning will tell you that a model will always work in your own data, right? So whatever you publish in terms of AUC is nonsense, right? Don't do it. Development only. The second is that people use bootstrapping, leave one out, cross-validation. So they mix the data set around, and especially bootstrapping, which is resampling, is almost equally bad. Because again, you have a data set which you're just rehashing. And it doesn't, the values that you get out of it are quite useless. The better is to split your data. To say, well, we have one data set, let's put aside randomly 25% or 30% of the data there, and we'll do the modeling on the 70%, and only at the very end will we validate in that set. Right? That's called validation. And one of the things you can do is random, so take 30% and put it somewhere in a locker. Probably better is to do it non-randomly, and in medicine what we typically do is we learn, for instance, with the data until 2015, and we use 2016 as a validation set. So it's a non-random split in time, but we're trying to prospectively see if the model works looking forward, and you can do this with a moving thing, so you can continuously predict outcomes in the future. So that's a non-random set, it's better. What's even which we try to do only actually at MAASTRO is this. You have one hospital giving you a development set or a training set, and the other hospital giving you a validation set. So remember when I showed this Eurocat with Hasselt and Liège, you'd see that we learn on 4 centers and we validate it in the 5th, in Liège. That's called external validation. And so it's development and validation using separate data. That is what we want. And what's even better compared to that is somebody, if we publish a paper, somebody takes our model, implements that in their own software and validates it in their own data set. That is the type 4 and the best way to do it. Okay? So we try to only do 3 and 4 because we think 1 to 2 just mess things up. Quite important, proper validation. Okay. So we have data. We've learned a model from it. How do we now get it into clinical practice? And what are the challenges there? I'm going to give you 2 examples, I think, and then some challenges that we are facing. The first one is very timely. It's proton therapy. So I work in a radiotherapy clinic, so we irradiate people to cure them of their cancer. And what we do is, on the right-hand side, traditional therapy. So suppose you have a brain cancer, so that's this brown thing in the middle, and we irradiate it with X-rays. X-rays are they are ongeladen. What's that in English? They don't have charge. They're uncharged. Thank you. And so what that means is that they just flow through the body, and so the photons would go, would go past the tumor and actually give a lot of dose here in the normal brain. And that's bad because you get complications in there, right? Headaches, and you forget things, and of course it's for the rest of your body as well. And that's the reason, for instance, why if you irradiate the thorax, people get a radiation pneumonitis is because of this phenomenon. So this is traditional photons that we do now. Proton therapy is better because because they're charged, they stop here just after the tumor. And so you save this whole part of the brain from toxicities. Okay, so that's, on paper it looks great, huh? But there are, of course, a few issues. We're going to build 4 proton therapy centers in Holland, and which means we have about 2,000 slots. But every year, 50,000 patients get irradiated. Which of the 50,000 will get protons, is the question we ask ourselves. Because it's not only, we have only a few slots, it's also about 3 times more expensive than normal radiation. And the issue is, because it's new, we don't have any evidence that it works. On paper, like the Philips CT scanner, it works better, but we don't know by how much. And we can only know by how much if we build it and start irradiating people. So it's like, catch-22. And so we are faced with a situation, who gets it? And we convinced our ministry to do the following, which is model-based indications. What we'll do is, we'll make a photon simulation and a proton simulation. I'll go through this little thing here. And here you have a model in there that predicts the likely toxicity of photons versus protons. And only if the patient, based on the model, is expected to have really clinically meaningful reduced toxicity, then they are allowed to be sent to protons. So this will be a technology that we introduce in Holland where the computer says yes, and not the doctor. Right? So very different way, model-based. And of course, for every of these patients that we treat with proton therapy, we collect the data, we try to make the models better and do it, have this circle running to continuously try to select these patients that really need proton therapy. So that's and Groningen has started, and I think Delft will start soon, and Maastricht will start at the end of the year, if all goes well. Now, you might say, well, that's interesting, but that's kind of fancy. But how do you change lives of cancer patients? How do you save lives with this? So I'm going to give you the example of what we did in Australia. And again, this is lung cancer. And if you have lung cancer, there's this palette of treatments that you can choose. So there's palliative radiotherapy, so that's a low dose. It's not meant to cure you. It's just meant to relieve you of the symptoms. And then you have radicals, so high-dose radiotherapy, and you can combine it with chemotherapy, and you can escalate. What this means is when you go around this circle, it becomes more and more aggressive, the therapy. Your chances of survival go up, but your chance of toxicity as well. So it's a balance. There's no perfect thing. It is a balance between survival and quality of life. Now in Holland, we have a guideline. In Holland, the guideline says every single patient with non-small cell lung cancer, at least if they're not metastasized, they have to get a high dose of radiotherapy. That's the guideline. So everyone gets that in Holland. In Australia, they don't agree with that, or they don't have that guideline. They only give about 50% of their patients a high dose, and 50% of their patients get this low dose just to relieve their symptoms. Okay, that's the setting. And from this Dutch data, we have a model that can predict the outcome, so the survival of patients, if they get a high dose. And now we can run this model in these patients and see what would have happened in Australia if they would have given those patients a high dose instead of a low dose. So that was a question we asked ourselves. This is the result. So these are patients in Australia that got a low dose of radiation. The first thing you see is that about 1 in 5 patients survives. Right? That's lung cancer. It's a very poor outcome disease. 1 in 5 survives. But also what you see, there's this black line here, which are patients that the Australians gave a low dose. But our model from Holland says, well, they actually have a pretty good prognosis if you would have given them a high dose. And we now can estimate what would have been the survival in these patients if they would have received a high dose of radiotherapy. And the answer is that the survival will go from 18% to 60%. Okay? So threefold absolute increase. There's no medication or other treatment in the world that can beat this increase in survival. It's just a matter of making better choices, right? So the Australians, they have looked at this and they said, well, you know, this is not good. So if they select a patient for a low dose based on their subjective physician assessment, they run the model. If the model says this patient is a good prognosis patient, they will do everything they can to get a high dose into that patient, meaning, you know, getting them admitted, using the latest technology, because those are the ones that need it most, right? They have the biggest survival gain. And they're doing this now prospectively in a trial to see if this is actually true, and I have some pictures on the side in a moment. So it's rethinking low-dose treatment in good prognosis patients. But if I look at, you might say, well, the Australians are not doing a good job in these patients, and it's probably true. But when I look at this picture, I'm always ashamed of MAASTRO and of the Netherlands in general, because what you see here in this bottom line, this black line, is the survival of patients at MAASTRO, at my clinic, that have a poor prognosis. And you can see a few things. These patients live 6 months, right? Median survival is 6 months. But in these 6 months, we give them concurrent chemoradiation to a high dose, which means that of these 6 months, we make them 2 months sick as hell, right? They're in the hospital, and we irradiate and chemo the hell out of them. What's the survival gain compared to what the Australians do, which is not give chemo and just have some symptom relief, which is which is maybe a week in the hospital? The gain in survival is 0 compared to what we do. So we massively overtreat a quarter of our patients in Holland. Right? And this is the message. When you start combining data, when you have different treatments, it's not about who's good and who's bad. It is about learning both. You always learn something from diversity and from sharing data. And these are, well, the actual results in Australia. So what are some challenges then? I'm almost done. What are the challenges that we still face? Well, this is one of them. If you look at this headline in The Guardian, driver dies in fatal crash, you might say, well, you know, the driver might have drunk or, you know, looked at their smartphone. So it's not really news, right? Driver dies in fatal crash. But when we say a Tesla driver drives in fatal crash using autopilot method, we say, oh, that's terrible. The Tesla is to blame. This is asymmetric expectations. We think models should be perfect, like autopilot should be perfect. This is ridiculous. We just need these things to be better than humans, right? And we know from our gut and from the planes that autopilots are better at driving a car than humans, right? But the same for medicine. So if the model makes a mistake, if the error in the curve is not 1, doctors might say, oh, it's useless, right? But they're useless themselves, so what are we comparing against? The usefulness of models, that's important. So models have to change the decision that doctors find relevant. Time pressure is a problem. So when you introduce these models into the clinic in lung cancer, patient hears they have lung cancer, and and there's always a bad prognosis. It's not really a good disease to have. And then we introduce the models, and they have to run the models and choose between therapies. There's a lot of pressure there on patients, and patients don't understand it. So there's work to be done there. Models generally give bad news, right? Their doctors are optimists. They always think that the therapy will work, right? Which is not true. So models are more rational, and they give bad news often. And there's a competition between, what models do is, they select the best treatment out of the treatments that you have. That's not very sexy. It doesn't have new medications, immunotherapy, proton therapy. It is, so you have a lot of competition of more sexy trials. There is the problem of deviation of guidelines. So if we start treating at MAASTRO 25% of our lung cancer patient with a low dose, like we should have done if you look at the Australian stuff, we will be seen as giving bad quality treatments. Why? Because the guideline says everyone has to get a high dose, and so we're seen as bad quality. There's loss of patients and market pressure as well, so we might not irradiate a lot of patients suddenly, and that's a problem for us financially. So there's these challenges that are real and we have to solve when getting things into the clinic. Finally, you can download, or you can see all our models on predictcancer.org. There's an app as well for the iPhone and for the droids that you can play around with just to see, how does that work. And with that, we always have to thank a truckload of people because we work with a truckload of centers in the world. That's our group at MAASTRO, and thank you for your attention.